Hi everyone, my name is Jordan and this is All Truth is God's Truth. I'm a physics nerd with a background in theology, and I believe the words that we read in the Bible are genuinely inspired by God and reflect His thoughts. In this podcast, we'll mostly be talking about theology, but I may occasionally venture out and talk about a bit of science, or history, or even philosophy. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to cover freedom and omnipotence as attributes of God's purpose, meaning that this category we're trying to describe now, if you were here last week, we started with God's will. How is it that God chooses to do things, and kind of what is influenced by those choices? Is it just big things, just little things? Is it everything? And then this week we're talking about His freedom. That is, to what degree is He free to act? If He wants to do something, is there anything else that constrains Him? And then finally, His omnipotence, or really it's just His power, His ability to carry out those actions He's decided to do. But for God, since He is God, He is omnipotent. That is all powerful. We share this with Him in that we are also powerful. We can affect change. We can take action. But we aren't all powerful. So it's communicable in part, like all the other communicable attributes. Okay, so freedom, our definition, is that God's freedom is that attribute of God whereby He does whatever He pleases. That kind of sounds nice to a certain degree, right? I think there's some appeal to that, like, oh, whatever you want to do, just do it. I think for us as humans, where we run awry is that everything that pleases us may not be God-honoring. And so we read that definition, and at least for me, it almost goes, oh, that sounds nice, but wait, I'm not supposed to do whatever I please, right? And that may be true insofar as sometimes I might get a little pleasure out of, well, I want to just stick it to that person because they offended me the other day, so I want to say something hurtful. And I have the ability to do that, but that wouldn't be God-honoring. So with God, it's different though, because He is all good and all loving. And so because that all goodness and all lovingness of God modifies all the other attributes, including His will and including His freedom, whenever He does whatever He pleases, it's not like we have to worry about, well, if we ticked God off, He's going to suddenly only reveal His wrath upon us and not show us any love at all. With humans, you might have to worry about that. But with God, you don't. So, for example, in Psalm 115, verse 3, could someone read that?
Our God is in the heavens. He does all that He pleases.
Thanks, Jason. So there you go. That's where we get our definition. He does all that He pleases. That there's this implication of kind of whatever it is that God wills to do, He's free to do that as well. You don't get this sense, at least from that verse, and we'll keep unpacking this for more verses, but you don't get this sense that, well, God really wants to do that thing, but He can't because of some external factor that prevents Him. Other spiritual paradigms, polytheistic ones especially, that's not true, right? Because some God may desire to do something, but some other God may desire to prevent them from doing that thing. And whichever God's more powerful will be the one that gets to carry out their will. Not so from the perspective of the Bible. God is fully free to do whatever He pleases because there's nothing that's more powerful or more in His way. So that's one thing. We'll get into a little bit more about that down below. But we imitate God's attribute of freedom by our ability to make choices, to decide things for ourselves. And because we have that, God frequently appeals to our ability to choose. So here's where we see that Scripture implicitly, or even in some cases explicitly, affirms that this is something we have too. Not necessarily to the degree that God has it, insofar as sometimes I wish I could fly to work, but except for when I'm going to Roy, I can't, right? Like I can't fly. That's not within my ability, but nonetheless, I have this freedom, and thus God asks me to exercise that freedom to make choices. I referred to this next verse last week in Deuteronomy 30:19, when it says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live. So this is right at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which is a recap of the whole covenantal history and covenantal stipulations that God is setting up right at the outset of the covenant community of Israel. And so he says, I've done it. We've got to the end of the covenant. I've set before you the stipulations. Follow my will, do the things I've said, and you'll be choosing life. Disobey me, and I've literally warned you. Here's the consequences for disobeying me. That's part of a covenant. You tell them what's going to happen if you break the covenant. So I've told you, blessings or curses, life or death. But it's up to you. I'm not gonna force you all to keep this covenant. You have the freedom to choose. So choose wisely, choose life. So there's a really strong implication there that God wasn't forcing the Israelites to do anything, and they exercised that freedom liberally throughout their history, right? They broke the covenant quite frequently. Not that we're any better, right? We would do the same thing, I think, in their shoes very frequently, if not more frequently at times. But nonetheless, God's making it clear, this is your choice. Like, I'm just laying out the terms of what your choices will bring about. So Joshua 24:14-15. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put always the gods that your fathers served beyond the river. I think that's probably Mesopotamia, referring way back to the patriarchs. And in Egypt, where we just came from, right? And serve the Lord. That's a specific God, right? Not just like, serve the one God. No, it's Yahweh, his name. Serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you now dwell. That would be Baal. Amorites, the Canaanites. Actually saying, choose, you can serve Baal. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay, again, kind of a re-articulation of that. After having conquered the land, Joshua kind of brings the people together, again recapitulates the covenant and says, choose. In fact, it would seem that the Israelites had already been a little bit unfaithful, because at that moment in Israelite history, there was a circumcision ceremony wherein apparently they had not been circumcising as they were instructed to do. And so there's kind of a reality check from Joshua in that moment. And as part of that, he says, okay, God's given us a little bit of peace. We've moved into the land. Things are calming down. Not everything's finished, but with that peace and freedom, you're going to have the ability to make some choice. You could settle in and just kind of worship the local deities, or you can remain faithful to God. And even Joshua, who, is maybe one of the sticking points of the Bible in terms of, he's a warrior. He goes and conducts wars. And so isn't that kind of forcing people to do things? Even him, at the end of the day, he's like, all right, I'm hanging up my sword. I'm not going to force you all to obey the Lord or else suffer the consequences by my sword. Instead, he says, all right, choose for yourself. And me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. What about Matthew 11:28-30? Could someone read that for us?
Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Thanks, Lexi. So here we have an invitation. This is kind of maybe a bit more implicit, but Jesus is saying, come to me. Obviously, not everyone does come to Jesus, and I think the implication of this verse is that he recognizes. I'm not saying come to me or else, I'm just saying it's an open invitation. You are free to choose. Come to me. Okay, so this pattern in Scripture is the basis. This is point B in the outline. It's the basis for establishing and supporting freedom of religion. Kind of interesting to think of that, right? The Bible is replete with calls to be faithful to God, and warnings about consequences for unfaithfulness to God. But it doesn't seem, there's maybe one sticking point that we could talk about if we want to, but it doesn't seem to me that the Bible compels religion or endorses the compelling of religion. That is also not something that is true of every religious system in the world. There was a young man, when I was younger, I went on a few short-term mission trips here and there. And at one point we were in Macedonia, and I'm not sure, I don't think Muslim population is especially large in Macedonia, but there's some apparently. Because there was a young man there who was serving as our translator. And it was really heartbreaking. And I think about him frequently and pray for him. But he was our translator. He was a Muslim, a devout, I guess you could say, at least a following the faith Muslim. And he was very open with the Christian communities that would come through that he'd happily serve as a translator for. He's like, oh, I believe in Jesus. Like, I want to be a Christian. But it's like, my family won't be safe if I do. And so anyway, it's heartbreaking to realize that is the case in many parts of the world. But Christians should very, very far stay away from that. The Bible doesn't seem to compel it. And it doesn't set that example for us. Instead, we should be happy that there is freedom of religion, even if that means religions you very much don't agree with might start to flourish near you in your communities. I don't think that is cause for us to seek out limitations on those religions. I think it's just a reminder to us we should present the gospel faithfully, and we should live lives that are compelling for the gospel and that really show the goodness of Jesus, but that we shouldn't be seeking out ways to somehow coerce, even subtly, others to join Christianity. If for no other reason, then that would not be a sincere faith, right? Much like this Muslim man lived a somewhat insincere faith. He recognized that the consequences were very severe if he were to make that leap, and that's not a very good Muslim in that regard. And it wouldn't be a very good Christian who felt like they had no other choice but to be Christian. So, okay, that's just kind of a side point from Wayne Grudem, other than I think it's a good application. That, yeah, God, throughout Scripture, he calls people to exercise their freedom, never compels. And so we shouldn't be trying to compel either. All right, God is point C now. God has placed in all human beings a deep desire to be free, to exercise self-determination regarding many aspects of our lives, including the rules of nations. This is somewhat speculative history from Wayne Grudem, I think, but nonetheless, I think it's fair to say, yeah, when you look through world history, areas where a lot of freedom is heavily restricted, it certainly does seem like people want to seek out opportunities to live in a place where their freedoms are more guaranteed. I think the clearest example we have from modern history, right, is something like East Berlin, right? Like people died trying to get out of East Berlin into West Berlin. And they clearly knew that was a risk, that they might die. But it was so burdensome, apparently, to live under the Soviet rule that they sought out opportunity to flee, even if it meant they might die or even put their family in peril. You saw that not just in Berlin, but throughout much of the USSR. And similarly, I think that's what made the gospel so compelling in territories like the USSR, was that it was, there was this dictatorial rulership, and to have a freedom and peace and some kind of outlet for that expression in Jesus, to kind of guarantee that, yeah, you may die if you worship Jesus, but that's okay, because then you'll be with the Lord, and to kind of offer that as, okay, I can actually exercise this freedom. It might cost me everything, but I can actually exercise it. I think that may also be part of why it's so compelling and so attractive in areas like that. We get very little information out of North Korea, but I wouldn't be surprised if the underground church in North Korea is similarly compelling and attractive for that reason. All right. You can get a little bit of the political flavors of Wayne Grudem maybe too, in that he cites the political revolutionary Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death, right? That's just kind of an example from the American Revolution. But yeah, okay, clearly at least in the United States, there's a heritage of recognizing that this liberty is something we do truly cherish, even to the point of potentially dying for it. We'll go ahead and move on to point D, that a desire for freedom is seen in children at an early age, a godlike quality imitating God's own freedom. He had some stories actually about, I know, we have this with our kids, right? Like desire for freedom. Ugh, not always excellently exercised, but but he had a cuter story about taking kids to Baskin and Robbins and wanting them to, or them wanting to choose their ice cream for themselves. And apparently their son loved bubblegum ice cream, which I remember bubblegum ice cream and thinking it was kind of fun, and like now recognizing, what? That is such a weird flavor. Like, why would you want that? But anyway, his kid wanted it. And he also wanted to pick it for himself. He didn't want dad just like, and my son will have bubblegum, right? He wanted to have that ability to really survey his options, think about it, even though he knew and dad knew, I want bubblegum ice cream, right? Like, so there's something about that, I think, of, kids kind of push back on, let me do this for myself. All right, so I think that's true. You can see some of that early on in kind of human nature, that God has planted that there, a desire for freedom. However, of course, freedom can be abused. Kids can make bad choices, but sadly, even much more seriously, adults can make very bad choices that do a lot of harm to others. And so while, yes, we celebrate this freedom, I think we also recognize it's good to have rules and boundaries on how you exercise your freedom, such that you aren't allowed to just go kill a person, or even just strike them or hit them, or even certain language that incites violence is technically not allowed by United States law. And we recognize that it's good, at least to some degree, to put some limitations on that freedom, because you aren't genuinely free to just do whatever you please if it harms other people. And that's a good thing that governments have an important role to play in. Okay, but ultimately, God's freedom is a wonderful attribute, and one that he has enabled us to imitate the significant measure. I'll go ahead and pause there, since that's the end of the attribute. There is one other story about how, interestingly, in the history of world religions, one of the unusual cases is the Persian Empire. That I'm not going to say the Persian Empire was fantastic and wonderful in every way, but when the Persian Empire rose to power, one of their first moves was to instate freedom of religion. Effectively, it wasn't quite articulated that way because they weren't a post-Enlightenment European society, but they effectively let everyone go about and worship however they pleased. This is exactly what we see in the Bible. In Nehemiah, this is actually what's unfolding. The Babylonian Empire, which preceded the Persian Empire, you actually read some nice things about how Daniel engages with the kings of Babylon at times. And they really value, sincerely it seems, Daniel. But you also read about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, where freedom of religion is not a thing, right? You don't worship the king and you go to the fire pits. Or you pray to anyone other than the king, you go to the lion's den, right? There's a recognition there that the freedom of religion, not quite so much in Babylon. But then Persia shows up and King Cyrus basically says, all the people that Babylon captured, if you want to return to your homes and exercise your freedom to worship as you wish there, you are free to do so. And it's an interesting historical note as well, because when scholars looked at that passage in Nehemiah and read this, or even actually Second Chronicles records it as well, reads this like, okay, you can all go home. It just sounds so nice and fluffy-duffy that, like, well, that's clearly made up, right? This is just like a Jew having returned from the exile saying, it was the Lord, it was amazing, and he gave us our freedom, and he told us we could go back and build our temple. But that's just like a made-up thing that didn't really happen. Somehow some Jews managed to migrate back, and they kind of attributed this to God. But thanks to modern archaeology, there's actually an artifact called the Cyrus Scroll. Cyrus Cylinder. Pardon. It's a little clay-baked cylinder that's cuneiform inscribed all around it. And what you do is you take this on your camel, go off to somewhere, you'd ask someone to lay out a flat piece of clay, and you roll it in the flat piece of clay, and now you have Cyrus's decree. And if you read Cyrus's decree, it's almost verbatim what we find in the Bible. The subtle distinctions are that the scroll is a bit more generalized. It's more about everyone apparently was granted this freedom, whereas the version we read in the Bible it's made more specific to the Jews, their circumstance. They were allowed to go into Jerusalem and build the temple, whereas the Cyrus Cylinder doesn't mention Jerusalem specifically. But nonetheless, it's a real thing. And anyway, it's just kind of an interesting anecdote of history that's actually where freedom of religion in the ancient world kind of begins, at least on a cosmopolitan scale. The Jews maybe permitted you to exercise your religion freely, but they weren't really an empire the same way. Ancient Israel was never really an empire the same way that Persia was a massive empire with many dozens of different ethnicities and religions wrapped up in it, that they would say, all of you within this get to exercise your freedom. Sorry, that's just a side note and kind of an interesting connection to the Bible. And another, I hope, affirmation, right, that skeptics who looked at the Bible and said, I don't think this is real, I think it's just a made-up story, but there is, in fact, an artifact that very much validates that exact story and connects to the fact that we can celebrate this fact that the Jews were allowed to begin worshiping God freely again, and I think we're meant to celebrate that and also establish societies that do that. Okay, weird anecdote over. Any other thoughts on freedom?
Yesterday, there was a lady walking down the street reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
And I stopped and we introduced ourselves and I asked her what the book was about. There's this spiritual guru from Mexico who claims this is ancient Toltec wisdom, although it has nothing to do with the religion of the Toltecs who practiced human sacrifice, right? And it's called the 4 Agreements. And if you live your life according to these principles, you'll have a lot more joy and peace.
Okay.
So I Googled, and one of the statements, I don't know, somebody put up there that he came to because of this is, I will not let any individual influence my choice of what to do, even if that person is an authority figure.
So much freedom that even authorities can't tell me what to do no matter what.
Yeah, so like anarchy.
Yeah, basically, that's what if you follow that logically, I think you're calling for anarchy.
Yeah, and maybe almost omnipotence. Like nobody can tell me. Yeah, nobody can tell me what to do.
Yeah.
I have all the power to do anything I want to do. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah.
I was kind of thinking the same thing where it's like,
That's what I was like.
almost like, you can kind of look at life is, what makes people individual is their thoughts on freedom. How much freedom should I have? How much should I listen to an authority? How much should I be an authority over my children?
Yeah.
Over the political system, over the poor, or the sick. Like, politically speaking, should we tell these people what to do with their lives if their life isn't going what we would say is successfully? Or should we let them do their own thing? Is that my place to do that? Some people on different sides of the spectrum say, well, ask them. Like, are you happy being a homeless person? Yeah, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. And other people say, no, we should take control of that situation and not let them be free. And other people would say and so it can be what do you do with your free time? What do you do with your free money? It's just who you are as a person is really wrapped up in what are your views on freedom, and what should be done with that? And you should defend freedom. But you can just look at it from so many different perspectives. You can see the theological spectrum as well, like free will versus, just all these different things. It's like, man, what do you do with freedom?
Yeah.
What should other people do with their freedom? And how should I feel about that? It's really like a core part of people. And it's like that divine nature, God is free, we can have a bit of that too, but it's man, oh man, some people don't want to be shackled by the rules of even God, right? God says, hey, here's how it is. And here's what you can expect if you go off course. But some people are like, to heck with that, I'm going to do what I want to do, right? Yeah. And it's just, it's a universe of possibility because we have freedom. but it brings about so much too. It's a heady subject. I mean, you can go in any different number of directions, but it really kind of brings about your personality. You know?
Yeah.
That's what I think freedom means.
To balance it with duty. We have a duty to the poor.
Yes.
We have a duty to our children.
Yes.
We have a duty to all these things. So to balance that with their own personal freedom, that's
Makes us all unique, right? Like, what am I bound to do? What do I feel God wants me to do for other people that might encroach on their freedom, right? Yeah.
I really appreciate, Kashi, you brought up duty. I think that's such a underappreciated aspect of human life in modern America, probably is a good way to put it.
My mother-in-law is very slowly dying of lung cancer, and we have a duty to make her do things she doesn't want to do. Get up out of bed, walk around, take your medication. And her freedom is being encroached on. She doesn't want to do it, but our duty to her is to keep her as healthy as possible, and that's so hard.
Yeah.
That's so hard.
Yeah, that is tough. You know, I think we are meant to recognize and celebrate freedom. And I think we are very blessed to be citizens of the United States, where freedom is such a cherished principle of life. I think that it is possible probably to go overboard and say, I'm not going to let anything or anyone influence me in how I make my decisions even. In particular, right, this is not necessarily an endorsement of self-interest only decision making, where, well, if I want to do this thing because it's good for me, even if it's very bad for all these other people, it's not the Bible endorsing that is thus good because it's your freedom to do that. It's just simply recognizing, yeah, you do have the ability to choose to do that. When we look at what are the limitations we're supposed to self-impose, and particularly in the New Testament, Paul picks up on the love of freedom in a few places, and it almost always follows it up with, you're right, you are free. But if you want to show your brothers and sisters love, figure out how to subject your freedom for their benefit. And I think you can go too far on that as well, because then others can start demanding things of you that are for your harm and their benefit. And I think you are meant to exercise wisdom in all of that. But nonetheless, the pattern in the New Testament is that, there is some limitation here, because your duty is to love your Christian brothers and sisters and your family, certainly.
And I think that comes out big time when you see, the nest is emptying in a family. And I want you to be free in all your choices, specifically around faith. This is something that's so important to me, the parent. And you see, just oftentimes parents don't know how to bridge that. No, if you don't believe this, then is there? And I think tragically, well, then we're no longer talking, or to try to exercise that bit of control. And there's I don't have kids, but I would say, man, the last thing you should do is sever that relationship. It would be my 2 cents. But it's exactly that. It's this. You do have this freedom, but I desperately want you to make this choice. And it's the story of humanity. It's tragic.
That's why we have prayer.
That's why we have prayer.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you bring up that example. That's a great example. Thank you, Jason. But as you're describing, I just thought, well, how much more so God watching humans in Eden, right? Talk about, please make a good choice here. But he didn't stop him, right? He didn't show up Adam, cut it out. You're about to do something idiotic, or Eve, stop talking to that serpent. He gave them tremendous freedom, and then he saved us from it, right? But yeah. Well, that's freedom. So God is free. God is truly free in that there is nothing that can stand in his way. And we'll get to that here in a second with omnipotence. So let's charge ahead and move on to that. Omnipotence, or God's power, sovereignty. The definition, God's omnipotence means that God is able to do all his holy will. A distinction is that sovereignty is God's use of his power to rule over creation. That's just kind of a subtle, technical, theological distinction if you wanted to make that. But Psalm 24:8, who is the King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. So, all right, we get a little bit of a sense from that already that, wow, strong and mighty, he's very powerful. Sounds like he's being described as maybe supremely powerful, more powerful than anyone else. I don't know. Let's find out. Let's keep reading. So what about Jeremiah 32:17? Could someone read that?
Ah, Lord God, it is you who have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you.
Thanks. Nothing is too hard for you. So you don't find God described as omnipotent in the Bible, not using the term omnipotent. But you do get statements like this, which is about as close as you can get, right? Nothing is too difficult for you. It doesn't seem like Jeremiah is saying, well, yeah, man, wow, God can do anything. Oh, except for that one. I hadn't thought about that one thing. Oh, yeah, he can do almost everything except for that one thing. It really seems like Jeremiah is trying to communicate to us the God that you worship, truly anything is possible for him. Nothing is too hard for him. Or Ephesians 3:20, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us. Paul here is describing God as, all those things that you could even imagine, the things that you're asking God to carry out and to do, he's able to do them even more than all your imaginings. So you're probably underselling God's power, even if you're imagining quite a lot. Or straight from Jesus, could someone read Matthew 19:26?
But Jesus looked at them and said, with man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible.
So here, right, the disciples in this context have recognized, what you're asking here, Jesus, no human can do this. And Jesus kind of recognizes, you're right. No human can do this. That's why you need God to carry out any of this gospel mission. But thankfully, with God, all things are possible. So the impression we get then from passages like this is that God is all powerful, far beyond our ability to even comprehend. And we can comprehend quite a bit, I think, but whatever it is, God's almost certainly more powerful than that. All right, but here's some limitations. We are asked to limit our freedom, perhaps, for the benefit of others. That is a good thing to do voluntarily, but God cannot will or do anything that would deny his own character. So there's some things that God says cannot do. What do we mean? Well, could someone read Titus 1, verse 2?
In hope of eternal life, which God, who never lies, promised before the ages began.
Thanks, Sarah. What about 2 Timothy 2:13? Could someone read that?
We are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself.
Thanks, Ben. Or in James 1:13, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. So there's some things that it says like, no, these aren't things that God will ever do. God, it's almost accurate, it seems, to say God cannot do. God cannot be tempted. The example that Wayne Grudem gave was, presumably, apparently, he was standing behind a podium. He said, technically, I am free to, instead of teaching the rest of the systematic theology class, just, throw this book on the ground and start ripping the podium to shreds with my bare hands and scream and holler for the rest of this time. But I'm not going to do that. And I don't think any of you are concerned that that's what I'm going to do, right? I am free to do that, but I won't do that because it's not in my character. It doesn't make any sense of who I am. But even more so with God, because perfectly good and perfectly just and perfectly righteous, thus Like, well, will God tempt me to do evil? Maybe he will. Maybe he'll entice me to do evil. It's not that God's not powerful enough to do something that might entice you to evil, but he cannot, insofar as it would, deny himself. For he cannot deny himself, 2 Timothy 2:13 says. So it would be somehow a denial of his character, of who he is. And so those things are just outside of the will of God so severely that the Bible goes so far as to say he can't do them. That's not really a thing that's in the option space for God. But it's not so much, I think it's right to think of it, it's not so much a limitation on his power as much as it's just like a logical impossibility, more so than is he powerful enough. But I think it's important to recognize that there's some things that though God is powerful enough to do, he will not do. And we can be thankful for them because they're all bad things, right? Enticing to evil or lying or whatever. Those are a denial of his character, a denial of who he is. And so he's not going to do those things.
You kind of maybe juxtapose that with his holiness.
Yeah.
Like, it kind of comes right alongside, like, he's not going to do anything that's not holy because he's a holy God.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so you just kind of use that as a litmus test of, like, could do it, but won't because holy. Right?
Yeah.
Kind of,
Yeah, exactly.
maybe.
Exactly. Yeah. And it seems to be so far outside of the options that the Bible really says cannot, right? Like, it's not even like, well, he could, but he won't. Right? Like, I think it's helpful to think of it that way because I think that's roughly what they're saying. But apparently it's such a severe he won't that the Bible just says he can. Yeah.
I don't know what denomination everyone is. My denomination uses Westminster Catechism.
Yeah, okay.
And I think that's a good illustration to teach our kids, can God do anything? And the answer is yes, God can do all his holy will.
All his holy will, yeah.
So it's, we can't sin.
Yeah.
Just knowing that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and that is technically in our definition here, right? To carry out all his holy will. That we're already kind of modifying it by like, he only wills to do things that are good and holy. So things that are outside of that, he's not going to carry those things out. All right, I'm gonna take a quick sidestep. Can God make a rock so heavy he can't pick it up? All right, I'm gonna resolve this. Don't worry, it's easy, guys. Yeah. All right. So first of all, this is just like a little bit of apologetics 101 because I think that's a silly little like, well, an omnipotent God is impossible because look, I found a problem you can't solve. I think that's silly because that's really just saying, an omnipotent being can't exist. Not that the God of the Bible doesn't exist. That's really an objection to the concept of omnipotence. It has nothing to do with specifically the Christian God. I think they are right to point out there's a logical contradiction. But that's different. That's not saying that God is not omnipotent. That's saying there's a logical contradiction in what we mean by the word omnipotent. And this is true of every logical system, every single one in the world, including math. Math is based on a finite number of what we call axioms, base core truths that we're pretty sure are true because as Euclid, the kind of progenitor of logical mathematics in Euclid's Elements of Geometry, he's basically just says, yeah, the axioms, they're so evidently true that even an idiot thinks they're true. Like, that's how he puts it. It's just like, nobody can refuse to believe this. And so those are your axioms. You don't prove those. And then you build up from the rules of logic and from those a bunch of conclusions. And every logical system that has a finite number of axioms necessarily contains within it logical contradictions in the sense that you can make a logical paradox. You can make a statement which is either true or false, but which cannot be proven to be true or false. All right, that last sentence right there, that's Gödel's theorem. It's a thing of modern mathematics that kind of unfolded, actually, all of modern philosophy. But anyway, that's just a thing. That's just a characteristic of logic. All right, so there's step one. You haven't really said anything about the Christian God. You've really just pointed out logic has problems. And so when we talk about an omnipotent God and we're going to think about it logically, we're going to run into problems. Not a surprise and not a contradiction of God or his omnipotence. That's step one. Step two is you could ask them that, all right, so within our rigorous logical thinking, we might run into a paradox, but there are escapes from these paradoxes, and that is to add additional axioms. As an example, in mathematics, there was a bit of a mathematical revolution when we added one axiom. We've added axioms many times to what we call modern number theory, but one of them was the addition of the axiom, there exists a number such that the square of that number is -1. That's a simple enough-ish axiom, but we added that to number theory. We now call that number I, which we represent as kind of the square root of -1. But we didn't used to do math with that, thinking that that was a thing. Now that we do math with that, all kinds of new things have opened up, and you can prove all kinds of things that you couldn't prove before. The logical space opens up a lot. And so there might be a logical way to actually reconcile this paradox of, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? And you could still, in fact, affirm a strictly omnipotent God that doesn't really create any problems once we think a bit more broadly in terms of our logic. But the imitation of God's power. So God has given us power, physical, mental, and spiritual, to bring about good results in the world. It's a tiny reflection of his infinite power, but it's still a good thing. A desire to imitate God's power is the reason why we enjoy being strong rather than weak. That is, that we like our freedom. We like having the option space. It seems like we like being able to carry out those options. As our bodies deteriorate, as we age, and we have less and less option space, eventually that can become really frustrating, right? And then we become more and more dependent on those who have the ability to do these things. I think that's an indicator also that, yeah, okay, this power, not a bad thing, and that we kind of enjoy and celebrate that we can make good decisions. We have that freedom. And when we have the power to carry out those good decisions, that's something we can celebrate in. And as we get less and less of that as we age, we see that it's a marring effect of sin, and we see that, that we're losing something that's good to be celebrated. However, a desire to power might be good, but it's so easily corrupted, right, by sinful human beings. More political philosophy from Wayne Grudem, that thus you probably got to break that power up sometimes. This is his application is that, limitations on power can be good too. That can come about in a number of different ways. His example being multiple elders in a church. Having just one elder oversee an entire church community can easily lead to abuse. I think that's almost certainly true. And that thus, the recommendation is, have multiple people in high positions of leadership in your church to counterbalance each other. He had a story about being invited to a meeting where they're like, oh yeah, we want to have some theologians there. And we really just need Wayne Grudem. You're just so smart and so good. And he kind of chuckled to himself, like, oh yeah. But then he admitted in the context of his classroom anyway, that, I realized afterwards, I should have stopped that guy and like, no, you need multiple theologians. Because I'm not flawless, I'm going to err, and it's important that other theologians stand around me to correct me. I think that gives a lot of value to what we do here too, right? That we're here to sharpen each other, correct each other, force each other to be careful with God's word, rather than one of us just running amok. Hopefully I'm not running amok. Please, this is why I speak up and tell me I'm wrong if you think I'm wrong, because too much power vested in one place can easily lead to abuse.
Well, because we are not holy.
Because we are,
right? I mean, that's the thing. You have an omnipotent God who is holy.
Yeah.
You have people who are not.
Mm-hmm.
And so that the power we have easily
go awry. For sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's not even necessarily, right? This stuff is not necessarily even a description of God's characteristic of omnipotence. Simply a recognition that, too much power in one human. What do we do about that? And so these are Wayne Grudem's hopefully wise reflections on, sometimes it's wise to break that power up or place some pretty stringent limitations on how it's exercised, which is effectively what the Constitution is meant to be, I think, in the United States, right? The federal government has a lot of power. What can't it do? And the Constitution is meant to, well, really, I think philosophically, it's meant to articulate what the federal government can do. It's just what's written down in the Constitution. And if it's not written down in the Constitution, then the answer is no, the federal government's not supposed to be doing it. I don't think we really have a government that operates that way anymore, but that's, I think, philosophically what was meant to be like, okay, we're going to write down, why do we have a federal government? Well, here's, a list of reasons why. We're going to do the following things, and that's it. That's what the government exists to do. Anyway, that's the concept, and I think we do well to kind of reinvigorate that mindset among ourselves as a civic population so that there aren't abuses of power, as we can all recognize there have been, perhaps quite increasingly so over the past several decades. Thanks for listening to this episode of All Truth is God's Truth. We would love the opportunity to help more Christians grow in their faith. If you've benefited from this podcast, consider sharing this episode with a friend and leaving a 5-star review on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to dig even deeper into the Bible, you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/ATIGT podcast, where we'll be releasing a series of posts designed to help Christians learn some of the historical and geographical background of the Bible. Feel free to reach out with any questions you have about the Bible or topics you'd like to see covered in a bonus episode. We hope to see you next week. Bye.